Hello there. So this lesson has a pretty intense reading, and this lecture explores Hauser and his look at both Aristotle's syllogism and enthymeme, as well as Toulmin's model of argument. A large part of rhetoric is the why of it, so instead of just saying, we're doing this, we need to look at why we're doing this. We're covering this reading to see how the legacy of classic rhetorical models are extended to the present day, and also to see how people have both disagreed with and built upon Aristotle's rhetoric to define their own approaches to argumentation. Today's keywords are field invariant, field dependent, claim, data, qualifier, warrants. The Hauser reading acts as an introduction to and a sampler of the Toulmin reading. Hauser breaks down Aristotle's syllogistic structure, noting, if we only pretend to deduce a conclusion, the argument is called invalid. But that's not all he does. He also calls out Aristotle's approach as one where, quote, all reasoning could be expressed in syllogistic form, meaning that Aristotle had a field invariant approach. You could use it to talk about baseball, you could use it to talk about visiting Sephora or CVS. Hauser notes how Aristotle thought this could be applied to rhetoric via the enthymeme. And that brings us to Toulmin. Hauser points out that Toulmin's challenging of Aristotle was the most influential take on his ideas. For Toulmin, syllogisms were closed systems, much like mathematical law. Toulmin argued they were actually field-dependent, meaning they had to fit the needs and requirements of the rhetorical situation. Hauser notes how Toulmin came up with a new model using two triads. The first consisted of data, warrants, and claims. The second contained backing, rebuttals, and qualifiers. This is all on page 266, and you may want to go back to look at this before looking at Toulmin a bit more to help crack the code. And so with Hauser's brief introduction out of the way, let's look at Toulmin. There's a great quote from the introduction. This is the class of questions with which the present essays are concerned. And it may be surprising to find how little progress has been made in our understanding of the answers in all the centuries since the birth, with Aristotle, of the science of logic. Hauser writes, rhetorical agreements succeed only to the degree that they satisfy our requirements for acceptable evidence and relevant warrants. These vary with topic, audience, and rhetorical aim. The value of Toulmin's discussion to rhetoricians is that he provides a means to analyze how arguments are actually made. Hauser writes about Toulmin's approach and how it lets us see how arguments are structured in reality. Let's move on and look at Toulmin's thoughts on arguments. One thing you'll note here is that Toulmin spends a lot of time in his introduction writing about logic and the relationships that inform logic as a field in and of itself. If we look at page 12 of Fields and Argument and Modals, we can learn more about how and why Toulmin does what he does here. He gets into the nitty-gritty of the argument, and he also looks at various contexts and various fields. Question 1. Explain what a field-dependent approach to argument is. So here's an informative quote. This variety gives rise to the main problem we must consider in this first essay. It is the problem of deciding at what points and in what ways the manner in which we assess arguments may also be expected to vary. The question will be, what features of our assessment procedure will be affected as we move from considering a step of one kind to considering one of another kind, and what features will remain the same regardless of the kind of step we are considering? A lot of what Toulmin talks about regards what it means to be challenged in certain contexts and in certain ways. This has to do with the field of arguments. If they're from the same logical type, they are of the same field. But if they're of different ones, they are of a different field. That sounds complex, but think about the phrase, apples and oranges. Why compare an apple to an orange? It's just not the same approach. And more importantly, it's not the same topic. If you're going to argue about basketball players, you don't mention baseball players, right? Where and when is, again, an issue. Contrast what Toulmin says and think of other ideas we've looked at before. Audience, temporality, rhetorical situation, kairos. He's still acknowledging their importance, but is also building a new model, which has more fidelity to his line of thinking than an older closed system form might have. Looking at the layout of an argument, we see Toulmin liken an argument to an organism. Here we're looking at the finer levels of argumentation, sentence by sentence, block by block, piece by piece, and thinking about the forms of it. Take notice about how he goes after the geometrical layout, hence proofs, like you have in geometry, and in Aristotle's Rhetoric. As Hauser notes, he also analyzes Aristotle's syllogism, and asks about the nitty-gritty of them, diving into their complexities. He also looks at the pattern of argument with regard to data and warrants. And here we look at claims and how they relate to data. Claims are, quote, conclusions whose merits we are seeking to establish, and the facts we appeal to as a foundation for the claim, what I shall refer to as our data. And so there's the relationship between claims and data. This is a big deal because we're challenged to a next step, another level in the argument, and we use warrants to deal with this. Here's a long explanation. Our task is no longer to strengthen the ground on which our argument is constructed, but it is rather to show that, taking these data as a starting point, the step to the original claim or conclusion is an appropriate and legitimate one. At this point, therefore, what are needed are general, hypothetical statements, which can act as bridges and authorize the sort of step to which our particular argument commits us. The warrant is, in a sense, incidental and explanatory, its task being simply to register explicitly the legitimacy of the step involved and refer it back to the larger class of step whose legitimacy is being presupposed. It can also be, as per page 92, implicit. Question 2. What's the distinction between data and warrants? How are they different? But there's more that's required in Toulmin's model. As he writes, it may not be sufficient, therefore, simply to specify our data, warrant, and claim. We may need to add some explicit reference to the degree of force which our data confer on our claim in virtue of our warrant. In a word, we may have to put in a qualifier. Qualifiers would, as per their name, add specific strength to data, warrants, and claims. We can also introduce other facts as well in an argument by using them too. They can be cited to confirm or deny warrants, and further serve data as well. We have to back our warrants. Here's an important statement. In addition to the question whether or on what conditions a warrant is applicable in a particular case, we may be asked why, in general, this warrant should be accepted as having authority. Backing a warrant is important in an argument. Toulmin states, this backing of our warrants is something which we shall have to scrutinize very carefully. Its precise relations to our data, claims, warrants, and conditions of rebuttal deserve some clarification, for confusion at this point can lead to trouble later. And so, you can think about how you might complicate your own argument here. But of course, there will be differences in the form of argument when it is applied to different fields. But as Toulmin writes, for the moment, all we are trying to show is the variability or field dependence of the backing needed to establish our warrants. So when it comes to the backing for warrants, it can be expressed in the form of categorical statements of fact, quite as well as can the data appeal to in direct support of our conclusions. Question 3. Make up a syllogism using Aristotle's three-part model. So after doing all this and setting up his model, Toulmin goes back for his take on Aristotle, invoking the classic syllogism. Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, so Socrates is mortal. What we're seeing here is two schools of thought going head to head. One contemporary and modern, the other literally ancient. Toulmin looks at universal premises as warrants and the backings they use for their authority. And so here, I leave it to you to go back over the last section and really investigate what is happening in terms of the warrant and the arguments being made. Remember to analyze the importance of the force of the argumentative statement. But, more importantly, look at how the diagrams in the Toulmin reading come across. Once you get over the textbook rigidity, and yeah, it's really formal, and look at these things as more in keeping with what an argument is. Look at how he constructs that model, how it flows, how the big ideas connect with the little ones, and how they also run the risk of messing up an argument, making it too complicated, putting in the if, thens, and buts. What you get with Toulmin is a logical take on argument that doesn't prize logic in a cold, unaffected vacuum. That would be a closed system too. Indeed, you can infuse arguments with proofs and ascribe them to the species of rhetoric, and those approaches are as valid now as they would have been the Agora or the Assembly of Athens. Looking at Toulmin is basically looking at how we take an argument and make it make sense in the real world. He's trying to come up with a realistic form of argument and a realistic take on argument that we can pick up and go, okay, I see what's up there with your data, I see your claim, but I'm wondering about your backing here, and I don't know about the warrant. And keep in mind, the warrant may not even be explicit. You can relate these back to premises, and you can relate these back to proofs, and you can relate these back to classical rhetoric, but ultimately, it's a question of making the best argument you can. The syllogism has a lot of places where you can fill in the blank, but it's all dependent upon the ability to read the audience, and see if they'd had the same experiences or ideas or thoughts that would make your syllogism make sense. With Toulmin, it's a little more direct, but it's also more applicable to everyday situations in which we might find ourselves. And with that said, I'm going to go ahead and close this lecture out, and I'll catch you online. Talk soon. Later.